when people first become vegan, depending on why they've made that choice. So for example, if they're doing it for animal rights or the environment, they may, just simply drop the meat and dairy and continue eating whatever they were eating. So they end up with a diet that's very high in refined carbohydrates. So lots of pasta and lots of bagels and just not, again, a balanced diet. And what we know is when you replace meat with refined carbohydrates, you experience no health benefits whatsoever. One is pretty much as bad as the other. So that's something I think is really important for people to understand. The second mistake I think people make, and of course there are several mistakes to be made, but I think the other mistake is it just simply ignoring the nutrition priorities. So, making sure you've got good sources of all of these nutrients of concern. So when you look at omnivorous diets, there are certain nutrients you don't really worry about, you get plenty of. Sometimes you get too much of. With a plant-based diet, it's different nutrients. And so when you remove meat, you're removing a major source of protein, iron, and zinc. When you remove dairy, you're removing a major source of calcium and vitamin D. So you need to make sure that the plant foods you're eating provide those nutrients. So for example, with removing meat, our richest source of protein and iron and zinc would be legumes. When you remove milk, well, one of the richest sources of calcium would be low oxalate green vegetables. Beans provide some nuts and seeds, and so you need little bits from all of these foods. Vitamin D, well, some plant-based foods are fortified, but if you're eating a whole food diet and you don't use any fortified foods, where's your vitamin D come from? Well, if you get enough warm sunshine throughout the year, you don't have a problem. But most of us live, in places where we don't get adequate warm sunshine throughout the year. I sure don't. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia. Well, our winter months, we get very little sunshine, and even if I'm exposed to sunshine, it's not warm sunshine, it's very cold sunshine. And so we don't produce any vitamin D from probably late October through to March. And so we need to make sure we have a source of that nutrient. So these are the big concerns, I would say. Vitamin B12 deficiency, vegan diets, definitely, vegans are at higher risk for B12 deficiency. Now, there's a lot going on here. So what people need to know is vitamin B12 is made by little microorganisms. And we have lots of those microorganisms that produce B12 in our body, but most of them are in our large intestine, and B12 is absorbed mostly in our small, and things don't usually go backwards. So at that point, once they're in the large intestine. So we don't get a lot of B12. If you had really bad oral hygiene, you might have some bacteria in your mouth that produce B12, but you probably don't want to have really bad oral hygiene because it'll cut about 10 years off your life. So we need to have a source of B12. And just a couple of things to be aware of. Plant foods are not reliable sources because we try to get rid of pathogenic bacteria, we get rid of other bacteria as well. If we fermented foods in dirty vessels, like tempeh in wooden vats that had bacteria between the layers of wood, we might get some. There are some studies from Indonesia, for example, that show tempeh being a B12 source, but in North America, we actually produce tempeh in stainless steel vats that are very clean, and so the amounts of B12 there would be very limited. And some people say, well, what about seaweed? It has B12, and seaweed does have B12. However, there's a combination of true B12 and what we call inactive non-cobalamin coronoids, or B12 analogs, that attach to B12 receptor sites but don't function as B12 and can actually contribute to a functional B12 deficiency. So, and when you dry seaweed, the active B12 some of it at least gets converted into these inactive forms as well. So chlorella may be a source, AFA, there's A few of the blue-green algae may be a source, but we don't have enough good solid evidence to say people can rely on those and only those. So right now, most experts are saying rely on something other than seaweed as your primary B12 source. And so what is that something? You've got two choices: fortified foods, and if you're a whole foods person, you might not be using fortified foods, or you can be using supplements. And if you're using supplements, you need 1,000 micrograms at least twice a week. If you're using, that's if you're using cyanocobalamin. If you're using methyl cobalamin or adenylyl cobalamin, you may need it more often. 1,000 micrograms a day, because it's a little bit less stable than cyanocobalamin. So we need a source of B12. If we look at all of the studies, I've done searches in the literature to see about B12 status in vegans. The folks that have the highest B12 status are generally omnivores, then lacto-ovo-vegetarians, then vegans, then raw vegans at the bottom of the barrel, because raw vegans aren't using fortified foods. And so they need to include a supplement, and if they're not, they have low status. So we have studies out of Germany, we have studies out of Finland, we have studies out of the United States showing very low levels in a lot of raw vegans. And if that happens, they also have very high homocysteine levels, which can increase risk of cardiovascular disease, which is ridiculous. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot. We're at such an advantage where cardiovascular disease is concerned. We just don't want to ignore B12. It's imperative that we include a source. And it's not difficult. The other thing to know is that the IOM, or the Institute of Medicine, recommends that everyone over 50 not rely on animal products for B12. And the reason being is that in animal products, B12 is bound to protein. And in order to get the B12 off the protein it's bound to, you need to be producing enough stomach acid and enough enzymes to cleave that B12 off so you can absorb it into your bloodstream. And it's estimated 10 to 30% of people over 50 don't. So it's, if you're relying only on animal products for your B12 at that age, there's a possibility you're not actually getting it, and you can become quite B12 deficient. And one of the symptoms can be, the beginnings of dementia. So it's not a nutrient to fool around with. If you are a vegan or a raw vegan mom who has a baby and you are B12 deficient, that baby could have irreversible brain damage within a few months of birth. This is not an optional nutrient. It is absolutely necessary for blood cell formation, for the functioning of our nervous system. It's a critical nutrient, and so we just can't ignore it. So we need to be responsible and make sure there is a source in the diet, period.